Number 1. Funeral Home. I want to get this out before I go into the story. I do not believe in the supernatural. I grew up in a funeral home, and that often creeps people out, but I never really thought about it. It was just something that I had always known, so it didn't bother me or seem weird to me in any way. I recall as a teenager, a lot of my friends wanted to break into the chapel whenever a body was lying in there. They would get really pissy with me when I never let them. But hey, I have more respect for the family members of the deceased than to do something like that. I was 16 years old when this story takes place. My dad had gotten tickets for the family to go to a hockey game. I didn't go because I didn't really like hockey, and I actually had a lot of schoolwork to do. They also had to drive to and from the city, and would not be getting home until very late at night. There was also a funeral the next day, and the body was laying in the chapel. At one point during the night, I heard the doorbell ring. I wasn't expecting any friends over, or anything like that, but I went to check on the door. There was a young man at the door, but he was a bit older than me. He immediately asked me if this was the chapel where the body of that particular person was laying. I let him know it was, and then he asked me if he could come in and see the body and pay his respects. I let him know that we don't normally do that. He would be completely welcome to come tomorrow during the funeral. I wasn't supposed to do it. I grew up knowing that. But when I told the man that I could not let him in, he told me he was really good friends with the departed, and that he would be leaving that night and would not be in town for the funeral. I knew that I would get in trouble if my dad found out, so I kept refusing. However, the man did eventually wear down my resistance. I told him I would let him into the chapel, but he would have to pay his respects quickly. I led the guy over to the chapel. I figured he wanted to be alone for a few moments, so I gave him about 10 minutes. Then I knocked on the door of the chapel and told him I really had to get him out of the chapel so I could get back to work. There was no answer. I knocked a little harder on the door. The chapel was rather large, and he was in mourning, so it was possible he had not heard me. Finally, I opened the door and looked in the chapel. The man was not in the chapel at all. I called out for him a few times and told him I really needed to get him out of there. I checked the other doors, and there was no indication he had left through any of those doors. But he must have, because he wasn't in the chapel anymore. Figuring he must have found a way out, I locked the chapel back up and then went back to do my work. I fell asleep at my desk working, and I woke up to hear the largest and weirdest sounding crash I had ever heard, and it was obvious it had come from the chapel. Apprehensive, I went to check on the chapel. I made sure to bring a poker from the fireplace. I kept wondering if the man from earlier had broke back into the chapel. When I opened the chapel door, there was no one in the chapel, but the casket had been knocked over though somehow. As I approached it, I heard a sound, as if the body in the casket was knocking from the inside, trying to get out. Now, growing up with this business in my home, I really had no fear of the dead or caskets or anything like that. I didn't believe in the supernatural either, but this was scary, and I didn't know what to do. So I called 911 and explained it. The police arrived, and I told them what had happened. I do not think they believed me until they heard it themselves. Going over to the casket, they put it level on the floor. It was actually laying lidwise down. When they did, they opened it and found the man who had come to pay his respects lying in the casket with the body. It turns out the family didn't even know the guy. He had this genius idea to find a way to break into our home. He would hide in the coffin until everyone went to bed and then sneak out. The problem he had was that the casket latched from the outside, and he was unable to get out. He had struggled for over an hour in the casket, trying to get out of it. My parents were, of course, very upset that I let him in against the rules, but they didn't make a big deal out of it. I never did it again, though. Number 2. The Figure. Yeah, it is a bit morbid, but I did tend to like walking through a graveyard in the middle of the night. I don't know, there was just something about it. In this day and age, it can be really difficult to really get scared much. The graveyard by my house was very old and very poorly lit. I could walk through there, and once the ambiance took effect, it was really a cool, if not always frightening, experience. I should probably mention that this story happened while I was a teenager, so I was still in school and living with my parents. I had a decent amount of friends, but they normally had pretty strict parents who would not let them go out, and remain out as long as I was allowed to. I mean, for the most part, I didn't really care if my parents did care. I still would have gone out of the house late at night. It helped me because I used to write scary stories in high school, and many times when you're trying to do that, it helps to be in an eerie atmosphere. The graveyard was not fenced or walled off at all, and there was a road or a paved path that went through the entire place. A car would be just barely able to fit on it. It also gave me a trail for guiding myself when I was out walking. One night, I was on one of my walks, and I was just coming up to the middle of the graveyard. There was a big statue right in the middle of it. I was walking towards that when something caught my eye, and I looked to see what it could be. Whatever it wasn't close to me, but there was a light on the far end of the graveyard. It was only weird because the color was strange, and it didn't move. I was convinced that it was not a flashlight. The color was off. I was curious, though, so I began walking in that direction. I figured the closer I got to it, I could make a game out of it. I was wondering if I could figure out what it was before I was completely upon it, and it still didn't move. I was able to make out the color a bit better as I walked along, and it was a bit green. The light, I mean. I began thinking that it was a lantern of some sort, and it was sitting on the ground. When I got closer, I could see a little bit of movement. I thought it was completely probable the person was a grave digger. I'd never come across him in my walks back there, but someone had to be digging the graves. When I got close enough to really get a good look, I noticed it must have been a grave digger. There was a dug-up grave, and someone was down in it. I froze and remained hidden behind a memorial and watched. Well, after a few moments, I noticed the man getting out of the grave, and he had something with him. I wasn't able to tell what it was until I saw him move directly into the light of the lantern, and that was when I saw he had a severed hand in his hand. I then knew this wasn't a grave digger, it was a grave robber. And it wasn't a grave robber stealing jewelry, he was stealing body parts. I watched as he put his hand inside the bag, and then he went right back into the grave. At that point, when I was sure he wouldn't be aware of me, I crept away from the memorial and tried to make my way to the exit of the cemetery. When I was far enough away, I booked it the rest of the way home. This is the first time I have told anyone this story. I did go back to the cemetery during the day, and the grave was filled in, but the soil was loose. I really have no idea what a person would do with old and decayed body parts stolen from a grave. Number 3. The church. There is this abandoned church on this hill, not far from where my aunt's house was. We always knew it was there, but it had been closed down for a very long time. The road to get there had been grown over years ago, and thus there was no direct route to get to the church. While my cousin and I, we loved abandoned buildings. Living out in the country for his entire life, and me visiting often, we would explore. We came across old sheds, old barns, and even a schoolhouse once. We figured it was a schoolhouse because it had desks in it. And most of the buildings were really rotted and run down. Some were grown over with trees, bushes, and vines, and many of them were too dangerous to even think about going inside. But when I was 15, I spent a week at my aunt's house. My cousin Jack and I were now old enough to go camping by ourselves in the woods, and we planned on doing that. We also decided that during this time period, we would try to find a way to get to that old abandoned church. Camping was the perfect cover for us, going out into the woods to find it. Because we were sure it would take us much more than just one day to get to the church. So we packed up stuff to get us by for a few days, and we headed out into the woods. Jack had a map that a friend of his, who had claimed to have been at the church before, gave to him. I wasn't so sure that this was the truth, but hey, it was supposed to be an adventure, so we went along. A worst case scenario was we simply didn't find the church, and then we simply just went home after a fun camping trip. Well, the first day was a bust. We didn't find anything, except what seemed like an old outhouse. Because it looked like an old outhouse, I decided not to go inside. About halfway through the second day, though, we got very lucky. Remember, this church was up on top of a hill, and the forest was pretty dense. But we caught a glance at what we supposed had to be a steeple. So we climbed up the hill and were astonished that we'd actually found the old church. The building was old and rotted, like most in the area. There was no bell in the steeple. It was blocked off by a picket fence, but the fence was missing many posts, and the ones that were not missing were pretty rotted out. But there was one other thing we hadn't anticipated. There was a small graveyard right behind the church. I was very curious about the graveyard, so I headed that way, while Jack decided he wanted to check out the church. He had no real interest in graves, so we split up. I'll never forget that graveyard, because it was creepy. It was covered in bramble and such. The stones were old and weathered, but there had to be at least 30 graves that I could find right there. And I went and looked at them all. And I guess it makes sense that Jack wouldn't have been interested, because it's not like we would know any of the people that were in the graves. There was a grave, far off from the church. It was really covered with briars and bramble, but it was set further back on the hill than the rest of the gravestones had been. I got curious, and decided to go and check it out. It was hard looking through all the briars. I really didn't want to get myself all cut up, so I really wasn't planning on trying to excavate the grave. I just wanted to get a closer look at it. I got down on my hands and knees, and I took out a small flashlight. I thought I could shine it on the gravestone and find out the name of the person who had been buried there. Again, I knew it wouldn't be anyone I knew, but I still wanted to figure it out. As I shone the flashlight through the mess of briars and brambles, I did notice something gleam just a little bit. It took a moment or two for my eyes to adjust, but when they did, I saw the eyes of a little child looking directly back at me. It was a face, looking at me. At first I thought maybe it was a dummy or a toy or something, but then it blinked at me. I jumped and was shocked that my body hadn't leapt out of its skin. I didn't look back again though. I just turned and ran to the church. Jack had been coming out of the church, and he told me that we probably should get out of there as quickly as we could. He wouldn't tell me why right away, but after what I had seen, I didn't need him to. It was later that night, when we had our tent up, that Jack told me why we had to leave. He told me that he had seen some food and belongings in the church, and they weren't old. There were unopened cans of food and other signs that it was lived in. That's when I told him about the child I had seen in the brambles. I don't know what to make of it, really. We never went back to the church. Hell, wild dogs would not have been able to drag us back there. But since we didn't, we never really found out what was going on. It wasn't unusual for an old building to have squatters, but it was really unusual to have seen that child. I can't explain it in any way, but I'll never forget it. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. I know it has been a bit since I've got you all some new scary stories, but I promise I won't take that long for the next video. I'm always pleased, though, when I see that no one ever seems to forget about me when I am absent for a little while, and that really makes me happy. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, feel free to hit the subscribe button below and the bell, or wait for the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, let me know what you thought of the video, and please share it with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have a story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But as always, it is most important to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.